So picking up with capital letter C, because of the troubles with foreign powers and the troubles at home, the leaders of our country recognized that there were distinctive weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. Because their own citizenry was willing to rebel against them was a real wake-up call for state governments as well as the Confederation Congress that something had to change. And they wanted to head it off before they did come back to another revolution. So there was number two, a preparation for change. Um, George Washington had invited Maryland and Virginia delegates to Mount Vernon, his home, to discuss some disputes over trade and the use of the Potomac River, and so on. And it was during the course of that discussion that the leaders commiserated and said, yes, we do need to have a much more successful government than what we have. And so they said, hey, let's call for a meeting of all the delegates to come down and see if we can rectify this problem. So a year later, in 1786, Virginia called for the Annapolis Convention. Unfortunately, only 5 states sent delegates. James Madison, sorry, there shouldn't be a comma there, but James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Dickinson were among those who did attend. Um, and even though there were only 5 delegates and nothing was accomplished, these 3 men had still clung to the hope that eventually they could get the states to agree that there was a need for a change. So then one more year passes, and in 1787, the Confederation Congress calls for a secret convention. And it was secret because, obviously, with people's fears of a strong localized federal power, they figured there would be great opposition. And so they decided to make this secret, while they sat down and discussed what solutions they could come up with. That way, nobody from the outside could interfere or influence their discussions. This was known as the Philadelphia Convention, but would later be called the Constitutional Convention. But when they met, they weren't really thinking about scrapping the whole idea of the Articles of Confederation. They were just hoping to strengthen it a little bit, to change some things, to tweak some things, to give it a little bit more authority than what it already had. 55 delegates from 12 states did attend. Rhode Island was noticeably absent, did not send any delegates to this convention. They met in Independence Hall, the same place where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and George Washington was elected to preside over the convention as chairman. He was, being an honored war hero, he was looked upon as the guiding voice for when the disputes between states would get too strong. But alongside of George Washington, there were several men who made some very important contributions to this convention. First, you have James Madison, who was considered the most influential member of the convention, and he will become known as the father of the U.S. Constitution. So he definitely was a very important member. Then you have George Mason, and George Mason came to the table with a lot of writing experience. He had been tasked with writing a lot of the state of Virginia documents, and so because he already knew the wording and the legalities, he was a very important person to have at this convention as well. Ben Franklin was the oldest delegate at the convention at this time, and something that we went over in earlier chapters was that Ben Franklin was not a Christian. Most of the founding fathers were of a religion called deism, which was a product of the Enlightenment that had happened in Europe. They believed that, yes, God created the world, but that was all the involvement that God had in the world. He created it, he kind of wound it up like an alarm clock, and then he kind of set it out there in space, and he looked on, watching how man conducted his own affairs. Ben Franklin had actually had good friends who were very strong Christians, one most notably George Whitefield, who had been a preacher during a revival in the United States known as the Great Awakening. And even though he had Christian influence in his life, as far as we know, Ben Franklin never did accept the Lord as a savior. But what's very interesting is that during this convention, the fighting and disagreement had reached a real peak. It seemed like they were not going to have a meeting of the minds, and that most likely it was going to end in failure. And it was Ben Franklin who stood up and he said, "My brothers, we must impart or implore the great power above for his blessings." And it's Ben Franklin who actually started the tradition that Congress open with prayer. He asked the delegates to pray with him then, that God would bless their meeting and help them come to a meeting of the minds. And ever since then, the time of ever since that time, Congress has always opened up its sessions in prayer. The next person was James Wilson, and he possessed a great knowledge of history and government. And this is the reason why we study history, is so that we learn from it. So he was able to contribute when something was suggested. He could say, yes, we already did that. It didn't work well. It's not going to work here. And because of his knowledge of history, he could help guide the delegates from repeating bad decisions in history. Then you have Gouverneur Morris. Now, notice the spelling of his name. This does not mean that he was a political leader. Governor was his actual name. And he was most notable because he was a captivating speaker and debater. So, what better man to give important speeches to convince others to follow, but someone like him. Then you have Alexander Hamilton, who favored a strong central government. He was very interested in finances, and he knew the economic problems that our country had at this point, and he was really wanting to fix them. And he knew that the only way to fix them was to have a much more centralized government. And so he would have been the biggest fan or endorser of the Constitution as it was being drafted. Some notable people who were not there: Thomas Jefferson was not there, which actually was a blessing. He's never really going to favor a strong federal government until he becomes president. He's going to do his best to promote the powers of the states over the federal government until that time that he becomes president and he realizes exactly what the country really does need. John Adams was a diplomat, and Thomas Paine had left the country to go over to Europe at that time, and they were not there to add their voices to the debates that were going on. And the last three men that were not there were Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Hancock. Obviously, all three of these men were very important in the revolutionary movement at the time. Samuel Adams had actually organized the protests against Parliament's actions against the colonists. You have Patrick Henry, who most famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," on the floor of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. So obviously he was a huge proponent. And then you have John Hancock, who had the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence. So they chose not to attend for various reasons. Some were, again, very afraid that giving a government power like Parliament used to have would do nothing but end in a bad situation. So while we're at the convention, we're just going to kind of roll right into Roman numeral number 3 for the last few minutes of the video. They decide that they have to throw away the Articles of Confederation and start with something new. So now we're going into building what we now have as the U.S. Constitution. Capital letter A, the points of agreement. People could agree that a new government was needed. They agreed that the U.S. needed a more effective and central government, that the new government should be a republic. Now, what does it mean for a government to be a republic? It meant that the elected officials were chosen by the people. They were not chosen by other um, governing bodies, but chosen by the private citizen themselves. And in a republic, the power of the government would be limited by the law. They would not be able to go beyond the limits of the law. And that's why our U.S. Constitution is so very, very important, because there is no other country that has ever been born, has tried to mimic us, that's achieved what our founding fathers did back at that time. And by basically saying that the government had to abide by the law. They didn't have that in England. No European or even anyone around the world. It didn't matter whether you came from Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East. Nobody had ever seen a government actually limited by the law. And the reason for this was these people, prior to the founding of the United States, they had been they had to live at the whims of those who were in power. You know, one day you knew you were going to be taxed for your farm goods, but the next day you might find out, oh well, not only are you going to be taxed for your farm goods, but you're going to be taxed for your farm lands. And there was really no way of being able to plan or get ahead, because just willy-nilly at the whim of another politician or a king at this matter. You had so many, all of the powers back then had monarchies in them. At the whim of the king, things could be upended, and all of a sudden the king could say, well, this is the way I want it, so now go out and make sure that it's done. And he was not limited. There was nobody saying, the law says you can't do this. If you think back, Howard, if you've ever heard of the story of Daniel in the lion's den, the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, they had something similar to a limiting of power. When the king affixed his royal seal on a law, that made it could not be changed. It could not be altered. It was set in stone. And so when the elected officials back then tried to trap Daniel because of his praying to God, they kissed up to the king, and they're like, oh, you're so great and wonderful, and you should have a whole month of people just praying strictly to you. So they petted his pride really well. And he was like, yeah, that's an awesome idea, so I'm going to do this. Everybody has to pray to me. And they had tailored this knowing that it would capture Daniel in a criminal offense that was punishable by death. And when King Darius realized that this is what had happened, he said, there's nothing I can do. So that's about one of the only times that we hear about a monarch literally being limited by law. Typically what you heard was people had to live on a day-to-day basis, not knowing when their officials would change the way that they lived. And so by deciding that a republic was going to be limited by the law was a very unique and revolutionary idea. Little letter C, the government would have multiple branches with unique powers and responsibilities. And we do have that. You know that in the United States, we have three branches. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And in the next video, we'll talk about exactly what their roles are. And we'll also go into how they oversee the other two branches. That way, no one branch becomes too powerful, and everyone is held accountable. And that's the key. People are held accountable to what they do and what they say. I'm going to turn this off now. This will be the conclusion of this set of videos. Now I'm going to look for the fact that I'm going to assign you a reading section, and that a quiz will be posted for you tomorrow. And then we'll pick up with the rest of Roman numeral number 3 and Roman numeral number 4. and then I'll have some work for you in your workbook. If you have any questions,